Score, the podcast. The only show taking you inside the studios of the world's most celebrated composers and musical storytellers.
From Blue Bonsai Studios in Santa Monica, this is Score, the podcast. I'm Kenny Holmes. He's Robert Kraft.
Yes, I am.
You caffeinated?
I'm over-caffeinated for this one. And Blue Bonsai is just such a beautiful name. Strangely enough, I kind of am a fan of bonsai and bonsai trees. I think they're beautiful and they're a very interesting art form. So
let's do another podcast on...
We'll do the bonsai podcast.
Bonsai trees. Our guest this week, this is his studio that we're sitting in, Joe Trapanese.
The great Joe.
He's done a bunch of huge movies in the last 3 or 4 years, especially The Greatest Showman, Straight Outta Compton. His latest, if you haven't seen it yet, Arctic, which I'm glad I wore a jacket when I saw the movie because it's freezing. That movie just makes you feel
chilly,
alone and cold.
But Joe's also, done TRON with
yeah.
Daft Punk. I mean, what a thing to have experience for any composer to work with Daft Punk. It's
and
so
he's
cool.
Produced with tons of huge superstars. Dr. Dre, of course, on Straight Outta Compton, M83, Moby, Zedd, Kendrick Lamar, Kelly Clarkson, Dierks Bentley, Mike Shinoda from Linkin Park. So we're excited to have Joe on the show today. He's also featured in Score, a film music documentary.
Definitely. I think he's one of the stars.
You were going to tell a story.
I was? Really? Another Robert Kraft story? People are instantly rushing for their pillows and blankets because they think, wow, do we have to hear another one? But
well, someone on social media was like, I want to hear more Robert Kraft stories.
That's right.
So I wanted to get a little more formal with it.
Really? Not just an extemporaneous, here's another tale from the crypt?
Because, when Robert and I have conversations, he often tells stories, and sometimes I'm like, wait, don't tell me that story, save it for the show. And he was talking about, was it Planet of the Apes?
Well, Planet of the Apes was a really interesting moment in my film scoring history. There was a...
Wait a second.
Gather round, everybody. It's time for another score story.
Wow. That's kind of an amazing thing. It's sort of out of... it's like one of those rides on Disneyland.
See, you have to bring that drop with you now.
Yeah.
Anywhere you go, and when you're about to tell a story,
play that.
Sound the alarm.
I think I'll have to keep it on my phone.
Now we're ready for a story. We're queued up. We're gathered around.
I think the Planet of the Apes story is just very interesting, mostly to composers, but maybe all our Score, the podcast fans, will dig it. I was working on Planet of the Apes. I think it was either Dawn of or Rise of. It's I've worked on the music for a couple different Planet of the Apes. This is one where Andy Serkis, the great, incredible CGI, he did They're Precious in Lord of the Rings, and he's done all these incredible
That's
roles
going to become a drop.
in different films. He was Caesar. I am Caesar in that new Planet of the Apes, which might have been The Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Somebody will remind me of the exact title of that first one in a new series. And Patrick Doyle, the great composer, was hired to compose the score, and he's truly one of my favorite composers. And what had to happen because of the logistics of the film was Patrick was receiving film footage in London, where he lives, that was the direct footage from shooting where all the, air quotes, apes in the picture were actually, of course, men and women actors with green dots all over their face and bodies and microphones strapped to their head and little cameras that had been hooked up for all this motion capture. So what Patrick Doyle received as footage of the scenes were these really high-tech images of men and women, sometimes on green screens, acting like monkeys with lots of gear on.
Nothing like the finished product.
Nothing like it. You couldn't believe it. And he scored to those pictures. And as he tells the story, he was over-composing and overwriting the music because he was trying to make these images that were fairly mechanical looking and not very emotional feel more dramatic. So he wrote a whole score based on the images he saw. Cut to, as they say in movies, Weta, W-E-T-A, which is the great special effects place run by Peter Jackson in New Zealand, then takes those motion capture pictures and makes beautiful furry monkeys on screen that look amazing. With
super realistic.
Super realistic, super real fur. Their eyes are very intelligent. Their mouths and hands are very realistic. And they put Patrick's demos up against this, and it feels like it's overshadowing the picture. And everybody gets very, very nervous. Oh, my God. And I call Patrick, who's in London, and say, I got to tell you got to come to L.A. tomorrow. And he got on the next plane, came to L.A. By the way, one of the rules that I had broken was a rule that I had as the head of music, which is never have the composer and the director on different continents. And I used to do that a lot. I used to have, the guy would be in Australia while the director's in L.A., or the director would be in England and the composer's writing in L.A., and it never worked. It was always something would happen.
Even with FaceTime and these types of things? Or was
it was okay up to a moment, but having them in the same room is an unreplaceable asset to have them be able to just, roll that back. And you know what?
Yeah, I can see that.
Can I take a walk for a minute and come back and talk about this? I need to think about the scene. And it's just better. You can do it, but it's better to have them in the same room. Patrick comes to L.A., sees the picture, says, I got to rework everything. And he does an unbelievable job in 10 days getting ready for the score date because we're late, until he gets to one very specific cue. And it's a cue where Cesar comes into where all the monkeys are with chocolate chip cookies. And Patrick said, I cannot, for some reason, I can't solve that cue. I don't know what to write. It's different from what I had. I'm kind of stumped. And he said the night before the scoring session, he was walking around his hotel room in Los Angeles. And he did what I guess every composer does at that moment when you're stumped, which he tries to figure out what will inspire him to compose the right cue for the scene as opposed to the cue that he had that was clearly too much.
And then?
That's the cue right there.
What happened?
What he did is he said he started to walk around the room and say what was happening on screen, which is as Cesar's handing out these chocolate chip cookies and asserting his power, Patrick says, I started to say to myself, I got a cookie for you. 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 And when you hear the cue, drums are playing exactly what I just said. Boom, boom, boom. And it gets tenser and tenser at the very end of scoring Planet of the Apes. And that's one of my favorite cues in the movie, called Cookies. At the very end...
The cue's called Cookies?
The cue is called Cookies. And at the very end of scoring Planet of the Apes, I had the choir stay for an extra 5 minutes.
And do the lyrics.
I got a cookie for you. I got it and it's on the DVD. To this day, you can go to the DVD special edition track on the DVD of Rise of the Planet Apes, and you see a choir and Patrick and myself on the bandstand, and they're singing, I got a cookie for you. I got a cookie for you. This story, young composers will tell you that inspiration can come from anywhere. And that ends this week's edition of
Score Stories.
Score Stories.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, thank you.
So I got to ask you then, every time you see a cookie now, does that...
I got a cookie for me. I got a cookie for me.
You should get have you ever seen the talking cookie jars where you open them up and like a sound will play?
Does the sound say, do you really need this?
It could. I think you can customize it. You should get Patrick Doyle to do it too, because his voice, it would be great.
Patrick tells that story much better than I. The only difference is with his Scottish brogue, you can only understand one every
I was gonna
5
say,
words.
we interviewed him for Score, and he was such a joy. But it was really, you're right, that
You need subtitles.
His accent is so thick, it was hard sometimes to understand what he was saying, even just sitting in the room. But what a nice guy.
Nice guy and a great composer in a pinch. Not unlike our upcoming guest, Joe Trapanese.
Look at you with the transitions.
I'm getting better.
You're on fire today. Yeah, that's right. We're going to take a quick break, and then coming up, we're going to be joined by award-winning composer Joe Trapanese. Stick around.
Hey, Score fans, it's Robert Kraft. We're back to the show in 25 seconds. If you like what you're hearing, do us a quick favor. Rate and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. It just takes a second, and it helps the show grow. Hey, thanks. We're going back to the show right now.
Welcome back. We're here at Blue Bonsai Studios in Santa Monica.
Love that name.
And we're welcoming in our guest this week, one of my favorite guys. By the way, probably the best Rolodex of stars that you've worked with. Look at this list. Daft Punk, Dr. Dre, M83, Moby, Zedd, Kendrick Lamar, Kelly Clarkson. Like, do you have any non-celebrity friends or...
It's
Joe Trapanese.
Hey. And Joe is the go-to guy for a number of things. Excellent composing, because I've seen Joe from the beginning just knock it out of the park. But also, Joe, in many ways you became and still are the answer to, rock stars. I certainly get to talk to a lot of pop artists who say, boy, I really want to be in film music. And somewhere by about sentence 3, it's, who you should talk to? Because I've seen you, and I think we'll certainly get to some of those stories about how you organically or accidentally became the go-to guy for non-composing rock stars to make movie scores.
Just like anything in life, I think, obviously, yes, it's organic, but also it's a complete accident and luck and kind of fell into it. I think, my curiosity is, why don't more people do exactly what I'm doing? Because everything about filmmaking is collaborative. So, people have asked me, well, is it different to co-write a score than it is? Like, what are the differences between co-writing a score and doing a score on your own? And to me, I think about that. I go, not much, because even when I'm writing a score on my own, I have to turn around and say to the director, do you like this? Is this working? Like, how do you feel? And the producers are involved, that sort of thing. So I think having yet one more person sitting next to you and kind of having a voice, if anything, sometimes it's more interesting, because when you run out of ideas and it's midnight and you're exhausted and have no idea where to go, you have someone to turn to and say, what do you think?
I like that, but you're also missing one thing, and it's perfect. It's perfect for you to say what you just said, because you're missing the humility involved in what you do. There's a certain modesty in the Joe Trapanese approach, which is you get all the credit because you're the big rock star in the room, and I will just simply be the guy that literally builds the entire house. And I've seen that close up, so you can't. I remember coming to one recording session. I know we're jumping around, and we should start at the beginning, but I'm going to tell you that I've been at a recording session of Joe's where the big rock star was in the back of the room texting his friends while Joe was sweating bullets producing the score. And I thought, this doesn't look fair.
Well,
because his name is going to be all over the movie as like music by, and then in small letters we'll say, and Joe Trapanese. And I thought, no fair.
Well, it's I love being, quote unquote, the fifth Beatle. Like, I think that's, I think obviously, the Beatles are the Beatles, and they wouldn't be that without their producer, without George Martin. Without George Martin, they would be nowhere. But, only, us sitting at this table know who George Martin is. And those of us listening to this podcast, many people don't know who he is. And he is as important as John, Paul, Ringo, or George.
Do you like that Oz kind of feel behind the curtain? Or
it's funny.
Is there something about like going to an event and being like, nobody's asking for Joe, but Joe did all the work?
Well, it's funny. It's funny that you mentioned that, because that is exactly how some of the artists I've worked with have spoken about the magic in the room. I think, you want to preserve that magic. And once you kind of let the air out, like I'm very careful about behind the scenes stuff and talking about exactly what happened in the room for many reasons. Obviously, you respect the privacy of the people you worked with, but also I don't want people to lose that magical mystery and love of filmmaking. Because sometimes if you see how the sausage is made, it isn't as attractive anymore. You don't want to eat it. So
that's so true.
Yeah.
That's
stay out of the kitchen of a lot of places. Probably,
I think it's actually a good place to kind of tell the story. I'm sure you've told it many times, but I'm not sure all our listeners know. I know a little piece of how TRON first evolved, and if I'm not mistaken, it has an architectural component, a kind of geographic component.
I was in Chris Beck's studio for a while as an assistant. I was never a full-time assistant with him. I was the extra guy when things got really crazy. I spent a summer there building some computers with him, and basically I was really fortunate that he got to know me and what my strengths were, which is again, like I've spent time with other people and they don't get to know me as well, but Chris got to see that I was classically trained. So that was one thing that was very important to Daft Punk, that I had a certain proper training of orchestration and music theory and harmony, etc. But then I was a synth nerd, partially thanks to Chris, because I'd always been a synth nerd with computers. And plugins, and ever since I was like 13, I was playing with computer music. But Chris got me into analog synths, so he lent me the first analog synth I ever messed with, and I fell in love. And so I got to know analog synths fairly well because that translates to what you see on the computer screen. And so, anyway, his brother is an incredible artist named Chili Gonzalez.
Which I found out after, I sorry to interrupt, but I was listening to Chili Gonzalez and found out at one point that it was Chris Beck's brother, and it blew my mind.
Exactly.
I had no idea.
Exactly. No,
I didn't know Chili Gonzalez is part of this tale.
He is. Well, I mean, Chili is the conduit to Daft Punk. Chili and Daft Punk have worked together before. He's done remixes with them. Chili lives in Europe. I think he's living in Germany right now, but he used to live in Paris. And so when Daft Punk was courted by Disney, at first to just write the club music for TRON. That's if you've seen TRON Legacy, there's a club in it, and so Disney said, "Oh, let's get Daft Punk to do that." And they approached them. The director Kaczynski approached them, and they basically said, "Well, we actually want to score the whole thing." And so that led down this path where Disney wanted to explore, and Disney said, "We're going to hook Daft Punk up with Hans Zimmer and John Powell, and they're going to talk to Harry Gregson Williams and talk to these." Our A++ film composers. Mm-hmm. And Daft Punk, knowing that Chili's brother was a film composer, said, "We want to meet with Chris Beck too." And I think Chris Beck is deserving of being on that list, with those guys. But for whatever reason, I think Disney didn't schedule a meeting with him until Daft Punk said, "We want to meet with Chris Beck too." And so they sat down with Chris, and this is where the stroke of luck comes in. He heard them out, what they were trying to do, and it was very apparent to him that to Chris that Daft Punk didn't want to work with someone. They didn't want to work with Hans Zimmer. They didn't want to work with the top. They wanted to create an artistic vision of their own. So it's interesting. While yes, I have certainly co-written a lot of scores. I make sure to never take credit for TRON in terms of co-writing, because they were the creative vision behind it 100%. And Chris, hearing that, saying, "Oh, okay, they want someone, but they need someone who's flexible. They need someone who knows their world, but they're also going to need someone who can mock up the orchestra and knows the orchestral sensibility that film needs." He literally said to them, "Oh, you need to hire Joe."
Wow. Nice.
Wow. And again, every time I see it became a running joke with me and Chris. Chris eventually told me to stop thanking him, because every time I run into Chris, I'm like, "Chris, I just want to make sure how thankful I am, because he really, look, what he said to me was really humbling. He said, "Joe, it just happens that I was able to help get you to a certain place in your career, but he's like, you would have been fine without that, so I feel very lucky and that he said that, but also, and very humbled that he said that, but what a amazing stroke of luck that I got that break. I met with Daft Punk, and
did they have their helmets on that first meeting?
No, they didn't. They didn't. Although at Halloween I asked to borrow a helmet. They would
that's
not let
great.
me.
Oh no!
Were you before going into this? Were you a fan of theirs?
I was aware of their music and who they were, but I was not one of the super fans. I was not like one of these guys,
which is probably perfect.
Yeah, like because I have friends who just freaked out when they heard what I was doing, and I was like, oh, I guess they're
kind of like if I can use an example, they're like the Dr. Dre of the electronic world. Like, they don't do very much, but when they do something, it's a home run, and it's anticipated, and it's a huge, huge thing. So, like, not a lot of people get the opportunity to work with them, I would imagine.
Meet them.
Yeah, that was, well, and the other
they're kind of mysterious.
Well, and the cool thing about that is they have the helmets so they could go, last time I saw one of them was at my local restaurant, just sitting down and having a nice meal with his family, so I think, like, that's, how awesome is that? You can't do that. You can't go to his local restaurant, sit down, have a quiet meal, so these guys have it worked out. But, the other thing that, part of this is, I think Disney wanted to hook them up with, someone very established, and even when it came to orchestrating, they wanted to like put them with the biggest orchestrators, and Daft Punk kind of pushed back against. So I think the reason I was also a right fit for them is because they wanted someone who was open to their ideas. And I think, one thing about collaborating in Hollywood, and we've all had stories, of working with someone who says, I've been doing this for 20 years. This is how I do it. This is how it's done. And Daft Punk was very anti that. They wanted someone who would take what they were trying to accomplish and help them accomplish it, rather than saying, oh, that's great, guys, but this is how it's done. I'm going to orchestrate it just like this other film score. So, that is yet another way I got lucky. I'd only been in LA for 2 years by the time I met them.
Why do I think that were you already at Henson?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
Yeah,
because they had a studio at the Henson Studios.
They
in
did,
Hollywood.
and that's where I first met them. Was they brought me onto the lot?
Right.
So yeah. So the geography of that is I stayed on the lot for a couple of years.
Got it. I thought it preceded it. I thought maybe you were there, and out of all this, it also turned out the guys on the lot with us.
Oh, wouldn't that be great? But no, it was really purely through Chris Beck and
how would you describe working with them? Especially coming into a new arena, because they're a huge pop sensation, but then they're coming into this world that they're not really familiar with. And we often hear that, like, the transition of pop stars trying to become film composers, there's a different kind of pushback with the studios and the directors and stuff like that. Like, was there a noticeable, were they feeling that different kind of pressure?
Well, even I feel that pressure. I think anyone who's a film composer will, working at a certain level will tell you, that there's always going to be the rubs and the disagreements and the pressures. But I think what made the TRON score so successful and that endeavor so successful is that Thomas and Guiman from the beginning said, we are going to become film composers now. There was not this, we're massively successful international artists and we're going to score a film and that film's going to be our record or something. I think is why it was so successful. I would never, point to anything specifically, but there are other collaborations that I've been a part of or seen where there's some of that music. There are other collaborations I've been a part of where the artist doesn't have that sensibility, and that's where things can become problematic. With what you're talking about, with the frustration, the fighting against the studio, and because what a film composer has to realize is, yes, they're making art. Absolutely, you have to consider. At least I feel like you have to consider it art of the highest order, but you are creating that within another person's art, within another.
You're painting their house.
That's exactly right. And if they want it to be pink, and you've agreed to paint their house, you're going to need to paint it pink, or find a way to convince them that maybe pink isn't the right way. But you still have to have that collaboration. I think a lot of artists who have been tremendously successful in the record world are used to being the be all end all. My way or the highway. Exactly. So I think again, what made TRON so successful is they stopped everything that they were doing. They could make, I don't even want to imagine how much money they can make per night touring.
Yeah.
But they stopped doing that for 2 full years to become film composers.
That's so wonderful, and you're right. It's unique because the worlds are very different, and they're different on so many levels. Of course, pop stars have the luxury of, I'm not going to release the record for another 6 months because I don't think I have the single. So they wait and they look and they record different stuff. You don't have that with a movie. You see the bus shelter with the poster of your movie and the release date, you got to make it happen. Also, I mean, I had this experience a number of times where the director would be really insistent that we have to get a rock star to score the movie. And you'd talk to the rock star and he'd say, I can do it, but, I go on tour March 1st. And so I'm going to stop for the summer. And you'd say, I have to come back to the director and say, you realize that if he isn't done by March 1st, you're stopping your score. It's just such a different world. So to hear that Daft Punk understood the drill is wonderful. I know there's so much else to talk about in your career, but I would wonder, before we leave that alone, what you feel you took away from working with them, as I'm sure they took a lot away about the way film music gets made, and they didn't know that. But is there anything in their process or in their gear or in their worldview that influenced your next movie or movies?
Millions of things. I was pretty darn young when I worked on TRON, which is going on 10 years, like 10 plus years ago now. But so I learned a lot from them just about, making art and being an artist. I mean, I owe a lot to them. But in terms of practicality, I think there's one story I'd like to tell, which is, we were mixing, and we were talking about Alan Meyerson earlier off mic, an incredible recording and mixing engineer. We were mixing with Alan, and Daft Punk wanted to listen to a cue without the electronics. They said, hey, maybe we're going to use this cue in the movie, but mute the synths. Maybe we just want the orchestra. And so Alan, turned down
Alan
the
knows
faders.
which button to hit.
Exactly.
I know.
So he hits the button
Right.
that, mutes all the synth, the electronic elements, so to speak. And I probably turned red because the orchestra sounded really thin. Like I was like, this is sounding really different. It doesn't sound full enough. And I didn't, because that was kind of my end of the job. I said, oh my goodness, I failed. And the guys go, I didn't say anything, but the guys go, okay, wait, put the electronics back in. Electronics coming in, a nice big full mix. And they say, well, mute the orchestra. So Alan does the same thing, mutes the orchestra, and all of a sudden the electronics are just thin and just kind of like uninteresting. And so they go, oh, okay, put it all back. And that was the piece of music. And I think the thing I try to say, and I was saying this a couple of weeks ago when I visited USC, I think modern orchestration, the modern film composer, so many people talk about the hybrid sound, and people say to me, oh, Joe, you're so good at electronics and orchestra and all this. What do you do? And I think what it is for me, because I have the classical orchestration training, that I have a sound in my head that has a balanced orchestra and whatnot, but I don't apply that just to the orchestra. I think that has to be applied to all the elements you are working with, so that, you could usually tell when someone takes an orchestra and adds one synth to it, or adds, an orchestra to something already full, whereas I feel the greatest success of that score is that we were there every day working away on this score and designing the orchestra and the electronics together from the ground up, from the beginning. So I think, in terms of, learning something to take away from it, and that was a huge one for me, is that, luckily that came natural to me. Like, that was just because I grew up playing in orchestras and playing with synthesizers. But I think, when I get asked about this topic, I talk about that a lot because, in the hybrid sound, I think it's ridiculous when you hear like a weird acid synth on top of a beautiful orchestra. I mean, they need to work together. And so I think the modern film composer, modern production, it would be romantic to sit at a piano and write by hand. I wish I could do. I mean, I do that sometimes, but that's not the job description anymore. You have to sit in front of the computer and design a cue, mock it. It's
design.
It's design, and that's, I guess, my design advice is that rather than thinking of the orchestra as one thing and electronics as another thing, is it has to be one thing, and you're trying to complete a vision that's in your head. And however, if you can complete that vision with 20 bassoons and 4 synthesizers, great. If you can complete that vision with a full orchestra and 1 synthesizer, great. It just needs to be designed and have a purpose, if that makes sense.
So when you look at the rough cut of Arctic, do you instantly say, I know the ratio of orchestra to synth? Did it come to you instantly, or was it an evolution?
You know, that is a great question, especially around Arctic, because Arctic was a very specific challenge because the director is I think he's brilliant. Joe Penna, and this is his first movie, and he's been known for a while as Mystery Guitar Man on YouTube.
Yeah, he's like a YouTube sensation.
Which is funny because it's a comedy. It's a comedy thing, but he's also a very intense, incredible filmmaker. And so, what was so interesting about sitting down with him to watch that movie the first time was hearing, and it's so funny, I'm hearing the music from Arctic. This is probably the most orchestral piece that score.
Yeah.
But, a lot of the temp was acoustic and orchestral and very musical. And I say that, I guess, in terms of like a lot of live instruments, not a lot of electronics. And it threw me for a bit of a loop because I was imagining coming into this movie, this guy's alone in the Arctic. It's going to be extraordinarily sparse, and where's the orchestra? Like he's alone in the Arctic. It kind of goes. There's this great story about Bernard Herrmann wanting to score. I forget which Lifeboat. Yeah, with Hitchcock and Hitchcock going, no, like where's we're out in the middle of the water. Where's the orchestra? And Bernard Herrmann being a lot more witty than I said to Hitchcock, well, where are the cameras?
Perfect.
So I love that story. But similar story here where I'm going, okay, he's in this foreign, desolate world. How am I gonna please the director? Because the director, of course you have to listen to those clues. He tempted the movie with a lot of beautiful acoustic orchestral music. How am I going to achieve that, but also achieve this other thought I had, which is it needs to be foreign. We can't be sitting here listening to beautiful strings and feeling warm when the screen, what this guy's going through, is so extreme. So I don't know, this might be getting ahead of ourselves here, but one thing I did was, I tried to write the most beautiful music I could, because there was this, there's this thought of the life theme, was a big thought from the director that him holding Mads's character, Overgaard, at the beginning of the film, holding a fish that he had just caught, and it's moving, and he's been alone in the Arctic for so long, he hasn't hugged anything, touched anything that's been alive. So just holding this fish is a magical moment. So there are all these beautiful moments that need beautiful music, but at the same time was finding a way to bring that across in a way that didn't feel like an orchestra, just playing away, and didn't feel like just a traditional film score. So I did a lot of stuff, like I used a lot of odd instrumentation. So a lot of that music, the life music, was 12 basses playing chords, like playing, really dark, low, but beautiful. If you hear, 4 basses playing a high note, I mean, it's a beautiful sound, but it's very otherworldly because, the instrument's not really built to play up there, So that was one thing. And then another thing I did, and this all comes from early conversations with the director and kind of telling him, talking with him about how, he was open to these ideas because, one of the first things I said to him, I said, look, I think there might be too much music. There might be too much acoustic music. Like, we might be going in a direction where, I want to try something, different that kind of does the same thing, but does it in our own unique way and feels like it's a part of the movie. So all this came with conversations came from conversations with Joe Penna. The other thing I would do would be to take either samples or recordings I had made. And this is really interesting. There were 2 things I did in this regard. I had 3 or 4. I was trying out these resonator speakers that I know this sounds crazy, but there are these speakers you could buy online. Like you hook them up to your iPhone, they're Bluetooth or whatever, and you attach the speaker component to like a table, and it basically uses the table to amplify the sound.
I've seen this, yeah.
You've seen these. Yeah, and one of them I used that turned out to be the most successful. I can't remember the name. They all, no major manufacturers make anything. You're buying all this stuff from cheap electronics companies in China or something, you know, but it looked like a pill, and you unscrew like a pill cap, and that's the speaker, and there's a sticker on it, and you attach it to something. So I would attach it to different, I tried metal, which didn't work so well, but one of the most successful was wood. So I had a nice big block of nice wood, and I put a speaker at the, you know, that sort of resonator speaker at one end. On the other end, I would have a contact microphone, and contact microphones operate by turning sound waves. You know, basically you put them on a surface and it transmits vibrations on that surface into sound. And so basically what I was doing was taking something beautiful and acoustic and filtering it through a piece of wood. Another interesting one was attaching the speaker to a water jug and then putting a microphone inside the water jug. So that way the water jug was resonating. So that was the physical component. And then kind of the flip side of that is I would take convolution reverb plugins, which you might be familiar with, things like Altiverb or, you know, that's the one that comes to mind. I was using a plugin called Fog Convolver, which I thought was so cool because what it could do, convolution basically is taking two sounds and blending them together. So what, you know, the most common use of convolution, like Altiverb, is a reverb. So you basically put either pop a balloon or shoot a starter gun or run a sine wave through a space, like a scoring stage. There's one of Fox actually, and then this plugin uses that sample of the room. You've basically sampled it. You've created a sound, taken a sound that's activated the frequency response of the room, and it combines that with, you know, the string, your sampled strings, or even your real strings. You put it through this plugin, and it makes it seem like the strings are in that room. So I would do crazy stuff. I would take the sound of like ice cracking in the. Like I would find samples people made of ice cracking, you know, sheets of ice cracking in Greenland, you know, and load that into the convolution plugin. And then I would play a piano through it. And so you wind up with the most gnarly thing you've ever heard that is kind of a piano, but not a piano at all. Or I would take wind, you know, and put that in the plugin and then play a string chord through it, and it just kind of becomes this frozen, blurry thing that kind of is organic, but is not, you know, it's like completely otherworldly. So, you know, that, you know, and I think what that then does, you know, it's interesting because if you have seen Arctic and have listened to the score, you could go, well, wait, there's several moments where I hear like a beautiful solo viola, solo bass, and, you know, makes those moments extra emotional because you haven't heard, you know, the pure acoustic instrument, you know, for the last 20 minutes. You've just been hearing a cello playing through an ice cube, you know, so all of a sudden you hear I
think it's unbelievably interesting.
Well, the thing that I appreciate so much about this movie too, and any like survival movie like this, is the lack of dialogue and how important sound design and cinematography really is, because you're trying to connect with a character, but you don't hear them say anything. So you're almost, you have to figure out why you like this person or why you don't like this person. And was it more challenging to score a movie with this little amount of dialogue, or did you find that to be helpful? How is that different from, like, let's say, Straight Outta Compton?
Oh, that's actually a great question. I think, you know, to be 100% honest, which, you know, I'm usually try to be a little bit more veiled than this. You know, Arctic was much easier to score in a way because, you know, it allowed me to do what I do best, which is write music, you know, and I think, you know, having dialogue is a great challenge. And, you know, like someone once said, you know, film music is like opera, but without the singing. You know, you have to write around the voice. You have to write around the dialogue. You have to make sure the timing of certain things is hitting. So when you get a canvas, which is like beautiful, you know, beautifully shot, you know, cinematic, pictures of the Arctic and one man, you know, wandering, you know, lost, you know, with no dialogue. It's like, hey, sign me up. I get to, I get to write some real music.
Yeah.
So for me, you know, I could sit down in this chair in my studio here and write music like that, you know, all day, every day, but very easily. But what made Straight Outta Compton, which you brought up, you know, super challenging, is you have this incredibly delicate story between these men who on the outside, you know, their music is full of bravado and like has this incredible like and I say this word with love for this music. You know, gangster rap was actually the first music I ever fell in love with. I was 8 years old, you know, and I heard, you know, I heard Snoop Dogg or something, you know, I just, you know, like he died, you know, it was like, I just fell in love with that music. But so coming as a fan from that music is very arrogant in a way, like has this attitude, this like just, you know, so I knew that going into that score, I didn't need to provide a score that had this muscularity, but I needed to do the exact opposite. I needed to, there's no hip hop really. Maybe there is now, but you know, from that era, there's no hip hop that has that sensitive, that you
tenderness,
know, that tenderness, that introspective, that sort of emotion. So I knew I had to approach, you know, but then, you know, that's the challenge. How do you coexist with that music? How do you find ways to write your score that doesn't undermine the strength of these characters? You know, it becomes a very much more complicated job.
It's a different assignment. I think we should come back after the break.
Yeah,
and talk a little bit about Straight Outta Compton.
Yeah,
and The Greatest Showman, because I think those are both good examples of doing what you just described, which is you have a lot of songs and a lot of emotion on screen that you need to somehow stitch together.
Sounds good. More to come with Joe Trapanese right after this.
Hey, Matt Schrader here, director of Score, a film music documentary. For the latest news from the film music world, follow us on Facebook. Just search Score, a film music documentary. Or let us know who you want to hear next on the show on Twitter, @ScoreThePodcast.
Welcome back. We're here with Joe Trapanese. We're just getting to Straight Outta Compton. Really cool discussion so far about some of your other movies, but you mentioned that growing up, hip-hop was your first love of music, and we got to hear the story about how you got the call for Straight Outta Compton. I mean, you're working with Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, some of these hip-hop legends.
For Straight Outta Compton, if you're a hip-hop fan and somebody calls you and say, would you be interested in working on this kind of story, that must have been amazing. And who called you?
It was on that one. It was the music department at Universal Pictures. So it was Nikki Walsh, who's incredible. There's also they have a great team over there from Mike Knobloch on the way down. You know Mike very well, Robert.
Mike Knobloch, yeah, I know him.
Oh yeah, you think you know him a little bit. No, and of course Rachel Levy, Angela Leas, you know, and so. I was fresh in their minds from Oblivion. I just done that movie with them, and I think you know there's a great there's a great story I've heard told sometimes. You know what comes first, the music or the lyrics, and some people say the check. You know, and I think you know part of that call. A, I'm fresh in their memory. B, I'm young, impressionable, and you know can work with artists and have an open mind. And C, I'm not that expensive, you know. Like, that's a terrible thing to get out there. Everyone, I'm extraordinarily expensive.
That was a long time ago. Let me tell you.
No, but the idea of you know, hey, we have all these songs that we're paying for. We can't afford you know X, Y, whatever this composer because they're going to.
I just
want
to put an asterisk on every conversation ever about music in movies. And music in general, but people always wonder about the art and the nature of the music and all that, and no one wants to acknowledge the fact that all of it has to be done within a budget.
Yeah.
And it's a really hard and fast rule, which is all this dreaming about how the music can be is wonderful, but you got to come in on budget. So you just described a music movie where there's a budget allocation for songs that wipes out the budget in some ways for original score.
It's not like sitting down and having lunch and paying for it after. You kind of have to
figure out how much
your lunch costs before you order it.
Exactly right. So they come to you and they say, wow, we've just bought filet mignon, but we still need something, a vegetable.
Exactly. Here's Joe. Well, you know, it's interesting. The way a friend put it, you know, this is a great story. He said, Joe, you're never going to get hired unless you're a solution to a problem. And so you look at the problems on that movie. Big artists involved, big musical artists involved. Maybe they have egos. Maybe they're going to clash. We need a score composer who's been in the room with big artists, who knows how to handle that pressure, who knows how to work with people. So, okay, luckily, I'm so fortunate. Luckily, I check off that box. Okay, we need a composer who, you know, loves this music and can write a complimentary score for it. I check that box. I love that music, and then C, we need a composer we can afford. And I checked off that box too. So I think, it was this, when I got the call, I tried not to get too excited because I would, what a great opportunity. And I, like you were saying, Kenny, I grew up with that music. I love that music. And so, I knew I would go into that meeting with the love and respect. And that was kind of my pitch when I went in to meet with the filmmaker. That was, I got the call from the studio, submit some music, send your music, send my music in. And then I think a month or 2 months later, I get a call, say, hey, come meet the director, come meet F. Gary Gray, who's an incredible filmmaker, incredible intuition. And what I said to him was, I said, the star of this movie is the music of these men. So I want to make sure that's the star. But also, this is an American hero tale. Like these are American heroes, and I want to treat them as such. And this, that was kind of my whole pitch of like, this is a rags to riches story, and this is not a hip hop movie. Hip hop is just happens to be the conduit, but this movie is about 4 men, or whatever, however many men, you want to determine were in NWA, who started with nothing, had every disadvantage, and somehow turned that into this incredible success and created art that changed humanity, so so I think he appreciated that. So that was, that was my way in. I think, it's very important that when you go into a film like that you have some sort of viewpoint like that.
I know.
I wanted to ask. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, I know Queen was really heavily involved with like Bohemian Rhapsody. How involved, especially Dr. Dre, who's a producer first? How was he over your shoulder working with you? How involved was he in the process of all this?
Well, I was very lucky that, through Mike, through the team at Universal, through all of us and the director, we knew, Dr. Dre was the elephant in the room. I mean, this guy I don't even know how to describe him. He's not only changed music, but he's changed, technology and there's no way around it. I mean, he is a force. And rightfully so, because he's been relevant for decades now. So we knew that eventually, first of all, he was a producer on the movie. And he actually, was involved from day one, was in script meetings, was on set. I mean, this guy was the movie, was into the movie. And so we knew we were going to have to play the score for him. We were going to have him over, play cues. But luckily, we designed that. We knew that was coming. So we designed our schedule around it. We made sure that I had a couple months to write the score, to get approvals from the director, to get approvals from, to get the music supervisor involved. The Mike Knobloch came to my studio, like everyone kind of supported me and kind of as a family came together and said, let's make sure Joe delivers this score and to at least a point where it sounds good as a demo. It's mostly complete. And that's when we had Dr. Dre over. And the incredible thing about Dr. Dre is he's very quiet. He's very humble. But and you think he doesn't need to be because he's Dr. Dre, but he's very respectful of other artists. I mean, he was very respectful coming to the studio and didn't say much, but when he did say things, it was like pinpoint accuracy of like what the deficiencies were in the score. And helped improve it. So, that to me, say no more. This is the reason why this guy is so incredible. And, he's one of the best music producers who ever lived. And this is why he's an incredible music. He listens. He uses his ears. He's not saying anything. And then when he does say something, it's exactly what you needed to hear to get you to that next step.
Well, that's probably different from the normal process, too, where like most producers or filmmakers aren't musical and they're trying to explain something to you that you're then trying to transform what they're saying and make it musical, but he spoke your language.
That's a great point. And it's funny because, we like to joke about this. A little bit of knowledge is dangerous. Like this, sometimes the most difficult producers you work with are the ones who, I studied, trumpet in school. So
why is it always trumpet? It's just, I knew you'd say it. I've had that sitting next to a great director who, when we were talking about the score, said, you don't have to worry about me. I played trumpet in my high school band. I thought, I really am going to start worrying now because you're going to tell me, I understand all this stuff.
I've always assumed going into this Straight Outta Compton movie, when you hear you wrote the score, that there would be drum beats and it would be hip hop, but it almost was steered in another direction to completely separate it from the music of NWA, and it's like very orchestral, which is really interesting. Was that a focus right away when they sat down with you? Like, we don't want this to be a hip hop original score. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting. Those early conversations with Gary and with the producers, had nothing to do with like specific musical colors, like orchestra versus this versus that. So, we were just talking about just overall, writing the score, just writing, what is that score? And to me internally, that was what you just said was my own internal dialogue was between me, my music editor, my team. We're just talking about, okay, what is this score? And I think, something very important to me. I remember telling a friend that I was doing Straight Outta Compton. They said, "Oh, great, you're going to write a hip hop score." And I said to him, "Absolutely not. This is the music of Dr. Dre and Ice Cube and MWA. I'm going to sound like a fool, I'm not. These guys are the most incredible hip hop producers of all time. So I'm gonna, if I try to do what they do, I'm going to fall on my face and be ridiculous. So I need to do what I do best, which is score film and find the natural, organic way of scoring this film. So that led to two things. So one thing was exactly that, using the orchestra, using organic sound to get to a place that you can't get to in the amazing music of NWA. That music is incredible at describing a whole range of emotions, but not necessarily incredible at describing something warm and heartfelt and something like internal tension and the tension between two people, like on a really deep emotional level. So that the music we're listening to now is exactly that. Something that hip hop is again is my first love musically. Is just not that great at describing emotion like this. So that was job number one for me, like get to that heart, get to that core. The other interesting thing, there were scenes where I needed to have an action tilt or, someone was driving a car and whatever, there was something more aggressive. And so what I did is just, and you could argue about how successful or unsuccessful I was at it, but I said, what I'm going to do is take my sounds. I put together like a lot of key sounds I use, like, film scoring, this is nothing foreign to film scoring, like taiko drums and, kind of the especially percussion, like percussive sounds. But then I was researching, how did Dre produce his music? Like, what type of techniques did he use? So I would take the sounds of my music, of film music, of our music, and run them through what I just jokingly called the Dre filter. Like, if Dre had these sounds, like, what would he do with them? So that's how I approached like the opening of the movie as an action scene. So I approached that in that way, kind of from a sample perspective, from, a drum machine perspective, that sort of thing. So, whether that comes through or is really present is one thing, but that was kind of my internal dialogue.
Really amazing job too, and that movie in strange ways helped me with another project, which
I want to hear all about it
someday. I can tell you how it's your work in Straight Outta Compton.
I thought you were going to break some news there.
Well, it's I have a picture at Warner Brothers Studios, which is the story of the Sugar Hill Gang and Rapper's Delight, and that's coming up next year. But Straight Outta Compton proved that a story in a certain milieu with certain kinds of characters could be a worldwide hit. And that movie really helped, and I thought it was a great job.
Aside from that, too, you got to work on the album a little bit. You did some string orchestration.
Yes, Dre had, it was crazy because I remember midway through the process, so when I'm watching the movie, I'm asked the editor, what song, like, what is this song? Like, oh, this is from Dre's new album. It's like the records. I'm like, wait, Dre's new album? They're like, oh yeah, Dre's been, creating this album, and it's kind of has its handshake with us, with, and with the movie, and we're going to use some of it. And so I'm hearing strings, I'm hearing sampled strings, and I say, we got to re-record this. So when we got to recording the score, we record the score with our incredible orchestra here in LA on Sony Pictures, and Dre, I invited him to the session, and he showed up right when the session was starting and was there just about the whole day. And I had, between me and my orchestrator, amazing orchestrator Jennifer Hammond, we basically took we created new string charts around these songs and just had them ready to go and re-recorded them, and they used them on the record. And so,
That's so cool.
So amazing.
It's
just a small
wonderful.
credit on a Dr. Dre album for your resume. That's not too bad.
I don't know if I don't think a lot of people are aware. When I was at Fox, they had an idea for a movie called The Greatest Showman. And the first thing that I was approached with Michael Gracie, the director of record, was getting lots of different musical artists to write each song. And we hadn't even gotten to the discussion of composer. And it was, Michael and I talked about, I can't even, we'll get Elton John to write a song, and we'll get these different artists to write songs for each thing. The project just kind of stalled. And maybe a year or two later, I left Fox. And then I heard, wow, they're really doing it, and they got Pasek and Paul to write songs, and they're bringing Joe Trapanese in. But I kept hearing the same thing, which is, I don't know if it's working. I have certainly had people that were on the inside. Wow, the picture's really difficult to finish. I'm not sure we're confident. Even up to the day of release, there was a lot of, I guess, consternation as to whether the movie was going to work.
Trepidation, the usual trepidation.
Usual
that comes with
trepidation.
Spending $100 million on something,
right?
You
you never know. And the opposite is also true, which is people high-fiving themselves just before a movie opens to go, oh man, where are you going to build your spare bedroom in your new guest house? Are you going to buy that land next to you to expand? And then you find out by Friday afternoon, oops. So both are, I've seen both happen. I've been caught up in both, but I was very aware that Showman was kind of a guess. Cut to the Grammy being awarded to the Greatest Showman compilation album. I think Greatest Showman is currently probably approaching $1 billion worldwide.
It's insane. I mean, the record, I think, I haven't checked in a week or two, but was back to number one in the UK
for 30 weeks.
Yeah, it's longer than like some Beatles records and
Peppers.
Adele. Yeah, some of the Sgt. Pepper. Yeah, it's just bonkers. But it's so funny hearing you talk about that perspective, because that is a very valid perspective. The studio, we spent $100 million. Is it going to work? Is it going to work? And this is where I feel so lucky, because hey, it's not my money. But also where my stress comes from is when I first had that meeting with Michael Gracie in October 2014. I had to look at my calendar. I said, how long ago did I start working on The Greatest Showman?
About right, yeah.
He showed me the artwork, his vision, and it was beautiful. It was impeccable. It was insane. I said, anything you need, I am here for you. Anything you need. And then cut to, I guess about 6 months later, I get introduced to Pasek and Paul. And I go meet them I met them in D.C. because they were doing the out of town for Dear Evan Hansen, the workshop. And I spent an afternoon with them, learning their music, learning the songs they'd written already, getting to know them, talking about music. And same story, like, oh my God, these songs are so incredible and catchy and beautiful and timely, and just this is exactly what we need. So I went into that one, almost trying to look at myself as like a caretaker, as a guardian of this beautiful seed, that had Pasek and Paul and Michael Gracie had created the seed, and I needed to help it grow however I could and not screw it up. And I think, this is what you're talking about. This is the heartbreaking thing about movies, is that no matter how precious the art is, it's made by committee. There are a lot of people involved. There's tons of politics. Like Pasek and Paul went from being young songwriters, kind of young nobodies who were really talented, to while working on Showman. I mean, when I came in, by the way, the idea was still Pasek and Paul would write a few songs, but really we're going to have Elton John write, then we're going to have this other guy. They wind up, of course, writing every song because they're so damn brilliant. But at the beginning, it was very different. By the end of this process, they had won Tonys, Oscars, Grammy. They went from being these quote unquote nobodies, which nobody's ever a nobody, but I'm just using this as a frame of reference. Unknowns. To being
within a year.
And
top of the game. Yeah.
Yep.
And this has nothing to do with them. This has more to do with the machine of Hollywood. That creates a ton more grinding on the gears of, oh my gosh, Look at what we have. So all of a sudden, people who are paying attention to the film who weren't paying attention because now it's such an important stake in the ground for Fox, and now they're maybe spending more money on it than they were going to plan to, and now they have to bring in an additional editor and this, and and this started, as you could probably recall, as a Hugh Jackman passion project. Hugh Jackman has made a dozen movies with Fox, and they've all made bazillions of dollars. So of course he has earned some cachet to say, hey, I have this passion project I want to do, and Fox, saying, yes, we're your partner in this, we're going to do it. Even if they lose money on it, they're going, hey, we need this actor to be happy because we're going to keep making movies with him. He's incredible. And so anyway, that's what
it made some money.
Well, it's one of these things where, it came out opening weekend and it failed miserably opening weekend.
I remember. Giant
flop. The reviews were just I've never seen so much vitriol. Like it was so bizarre. It felt like with every new review, like the next reviewer was trying to one up how hard they were cutting into the movie. Like just really just how hard can I cut into this movie? Harder than the last reviewer. I'm going to show them, And so it was heartbreaking to see, but also, I remember spending that weekend with my girlfriend, having, waking up, having a coffee, and saying, well, it's a shame. I mean, we've all been there where we wake up and our baby is dead,
Yep, exactly.
And really it's a terrible analogy, but it is true because at that point I had spent 3+ years on the movie. Believed in it from the ground up. From every note of every song was a masterfully written song, and here it was, DOA, Dead on Arrival. And so but we get over it because that's the business. I'm already on on my next movie, and so to see it, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Everyone was, and then so it's so interesting to see the weeks and months following where all of a sudden everyone's talking about
Why do you think it resurrected like that?
I really think it's the music. I mean, those songs, and I didn't write a single note of those songs. I have to set the record straight because some people are out there saying, oh, Joe, your songs are incredible. It's like, I wish I wrote those songs. That's all Pascal and Paul, and I'm fortunate to have been in the room with them and to work with them and to produce several of those songs and to create the orchestra for several of those songs and to be a key part of that. But
I heard that the movie was a success because of the orchestration. That tipped it. No, it's really a wonderful mystery, what you're describing, which is it flops the first weekend. It doesn't flop. I think it did 8 million or something, really low.
I think the movie cost like 80 or 70.
I mean, or the first night, maybe that's what it was.
Was this your first time working with John Debney?
Yes, it was, and that's yet another interesting part of the story. There was at one point I was, there was talk, there was rumors that I was going to score the film because I had been so instrumental early on in finding the sound of the songs, in finding the how the orchestra was going to be. It's like, oh, it's just natural if Joe scores this. And the director called me one day and said, I really want a classic Hollywood sound. And so I saw this a Jungle Book, and it's got this amazing classical Hollywood sound. I want to hire John Debney. And I said, great. Well, I mean, of course, it's hurt. It hurts you. But I said, but I know John personally. He's an incredible human being, and he's a great composer. So I said, he's going to do great. This is going to be fantastic. Because what can you do in that situation other than be, than say, hey, go forth. This is going to be great. I'm going to be a fan. I'm going to cheer you on. I mean, that's how you have to do it. And, I got a call later in the game that said, like John's doing great, but we need to connect it more to the songs. We need to connect. The score is too separate from the songs. And so, I kept on getting calls. I would not work on Showman for a few months, or even there was probably a point where I didn't work on it for 6 months. But the phone would always ring. Hey, Joe, it's so and so. We need you to come in
Anton.
and do this. Yeah, it's Anton, or it's Rebecca, or it's Justin. And Ben's. It's those guys, or it's so many people had a hand in making that movie what it is. That I got that call again that said, hey, will you work alongside John Debney? And I said, of course. I mean, John is an incredible human being, incredible composer. I'm going to learn so much working alongside him. And he felt the same. He said, Joe, I'm so happy to have you here because I'm going to learn so much from you. And we just had a blast. And it's stuff like that, the positive energy, that the protecting of that seed that gets you through how crazy these movies can get. How, because I remember I was on the Fox scoring stage, I think at midnight on a Sunday with a full orchestra, and people were in the booth, producers and this and that, not sure about something. And, what is Joe doing? What is he, and I'm very zen about it, because it's like the only thing I know how to do is make the greatest music I can make. And, is it the greatest music? No, but this is my baby. This is what I do. This is what you pay me for. And so I'm just going to keep doing that. So the politics of that crazy situation don't rattle me so much because of that. And then also, I was very lucky to have a partner in John Debney and Anton and Danielle and some great people at Fox, kind of help, be my therapist for a while. It was a really difficult project, but things aren't so difficult when you have that magical spark, when you're remembering that. You're like, I'm protecting this. I have to carry this forward.
So beautiful. I think the biggest takeaway in every story that you've told is something you actually mentioned in the beginning that's usually just the composer and the director, but everything you're describing is not only the art of music and the art of scoring, but it's the art of collaboration.
Yeah.
Because all of it you're
Being
describing
a team player.
as you're a team player with Dre, and you're a team player with Daft Punk, and you're a team player, in this case, with Debney, and with the studio, and with the director who might want this and that, and how interesting it is that as musicians, we're really focused on our expression and our self-expression, and that's sort of what we bring to the party, which is I have a ability with a language that's musical, and yet you have to subvert some of your ego sometimes, or your opinion, to listen to others. The amazing thing you've also described is how wonderful it is when others have good ideas, because we've all been through the situation where someone says, hey, I have an idea. Why don't you stand on your head and play it backwards and have the snare drum underwater? And you say, let me think about that. That could work. You have to be really politic but you've described collaboration as almost the pinnacle of what you do. The other thing that really came through, certainly from a former head of music, is midnight on a Sunday. All I think about is triple scale golden time.
Well, I think that's when that's when Rebecca said session's done. She just stepped in.
Budget
and said,
considerations.
I was going to say, go ahead and explain what you're talking about.
Well, you have to pay an orchestra union scale, and the orchestra composers may not be in a union, but the AF&M, the American Federation of Musicians, Local 47 in Los Angeles, is a union shop. Every player that's on a stage at Fox, Sony, Warner Brothers gets paid a very particular rate, gets paid overtime after 3 hours, gets paid fringe benefits. If you have 90 people,
and they're there at midnight. They probably didn't start at 11.
So sessions
started at 7. That was, and I say midnight. That's when Rebecca stepped in and said session is done. But
Good.
We were there until about 2:30 recording overdubs. So there were some musicians. I think there were about 3 or 4 of them doing overdubs, who had started at 7 p.m. and we were there until about 2:30.
Rebecca is Rebecca Moralato.
She's amazing.
Behind the scenes at Fox Music, making sure that all of this runs like clockwork. And what Joe's describing is 2 things. You have to do what you have to do to get it done, because you have a big clock ticking, and you feel the cash register going ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching every 10 minutes in a session like that, because you know that you are driving a budget up. And what I was describing is not only is there scale for the 3 hours, but the minute you go into overtime, all the prices go up. So... And they
keep going up.
And they keep going up. And the worst part is when you have a score that you've recorded in London and you need 1 extra day, and the decision for union reasons, for legal reasons, is you have to go back to London for just 1 more session.
Oh.
And you have to fly the whole crew back, and you have to go across the ocean, and you have to book the studio. Movie scoring is an expense, but clearly worth it. And clearly worth it when you have someone like Joe Trapanese being... your guy.
I love this applause. This is great.
It's really incredible, Joe. And we didn't even get to a number of my favorite pictures that you have scored, but it's just so interesting. And I would like to give not only a shout out to Joe, but every director who may be listening. You could ask for not a whole lot more than this.
Joe's
attitude.
the guy.
Well, it's just the attitude of not only gratitude, but the attitude of collaboration that every composer must have. And I don't think young composers sometimes understand it's a partnership with a lot of people to get to the finish line.
I just have one last question for you. You've worked with a ton of pop stars on their records. Is there anybody that showed any sort of interest kind of to compose, maybe mentioned it to you like, oh man, I'd love to do, I know like M83 has
most
dabbled.
People, it's funny. I mean, most people who I've worked with are curious about what I do and in that regard. And, I thought about, and some of them, I've told them the honest truth of what film composing is. They go, yeah, this is why I'm not a film composer. I can't do that. I can't, and some of the artists I've worked with, they're like, okay, Joe, so this artist is going to call you at 7:18 in the morning. They're in New York. They're going to do this, and they have 1 minute, and you're going to talk about this, and film composing is hours and weeks and months of sweat, and a lot of these artists they make their money from touring, especially now. That's very interesting. Back in the day, artists can make a living from album sales. That's no longer the case. So they have to be touring to make their money. And so touring and writing film music is not conducive. I've done some projects where the artist is trying to write in the back of the bus or something, and it's just not hugely successful. So I think, like most great artists are curious about other things, as I'm curious about like, what's it like to tour? I would love to make a record, like go into a studio every day for a month and just jam and make music. And that's the record, like that's sexy to me. But then once you look at the reality of, well, you got to get an advance from the label, and then the label got to do this and then this, and I go, oh no, I'd rather do what I'm doing. So I think it's a bit mutual in that regard. A lot of them have gone, we're good.
There's also a funny little dividing line as you look at the artists that Joe has worked with. They're all hugely successful. So it's, as Joe described, hugely successful artists have a whole career. What I always find is that the ones that have become interested in film scoring have this attitude. My record career's over. I'm not a pop star anymore. I'm not making any money as a pop star. Hey, you know what I've thought of? Sometimes people say some of my songs sound like movie music. Hey, man, maybe, what do you think? Could we talk about how I could become a film composer? And that's when you want to say, solar panels are a good way to get additional income.
If someone wants to be a film composer, they need to just become a film composer. It's
period.
not, let me call up somebody and talk about becoming. It's not, you have to become a film composer.
And some people do.
They do, yeah.
And some people do it and, as you just described, say, never again. They go through one movie and they find out the director wants them to stand on their head and write with a snare drum underwater, and they say, this just isn't me.
Do you have opposite aspirations? I know like Brian Tyler's doing some EDM stuff. Like, you have the skills to do something like that. Do you have any interest?
The Joe Trapanese Band. Ladies and gentlemen, won't you welcome, please, tonight, live at the Whiskey.
I love this. Well, I'm a huge Doors fan, so I would love to go to the Whiskey and
Let's
play.
do it.
But, it's interesting. Every time yes, it's very romantic. I would love to sit down and write a record, but just the fact is I'm too busy scoring movies and scoring, and I think maybe
good problem to have.
It's a great problem.
Nice.
And I think, one day I'd love to make, I have some friends who are incredible film composers who've made incredible records. And, I did a trailer album a while ago that was really special to me, but, it's interesting. It's a whole different monster, right?
It is. And it's
it's the air.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out what that noise was.
You mentioned, it's an advance and a label. Oh, by the way, Joe, where's the single? Get ready for that.
Exactly.
And we'd like to put this new artist on the label who I think should have a step out. And also, do you have a little rap section you could build in for 8 bars? Suddenly, talk about a collaborative
I want to bring
experience.
Post Malone on here.
Exactly.
You'd say yes in a minute. and then it wouldn't be you, and it wouldn't be your record, and it wouldn't really sound like you. And the worst thing that would happen is it becomes a hit, and they want another one just like
it.
So they all have their disadvantages, but I think Joe Trapanese certainly showed the advantage of being Joe Trapanese.
I feel very lucky.
Joe, this has been great, man. Thank you so much for
the whole
joining the
audience is here.
podcast.
Pleasure.
Yeah, there's
My
a lot
pleasure.
of people in here. They've been very quiet throughout. We want to, again, thank Joe for joining the show. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts to Score the Podcast or your favorite podcast platform if you like what you're hearing. And be sure to rate and review. It helps us grow. And maybe even tell a friend.
Oh, I think if you have any friends, you should definitely tell them, particularly if they're in the movie business, so they can learn about the fabulous art of film composing. Hey, Kenny, will I see you next time?
I think so.
I hope so. Thanks very much. I got a cookie for you. 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 I got a cookie for you.